been a long time that I wanted to share with you the spiritual passion I have for Mozart's C minor concerto. K491 in C minor, therefore, a tonality of so much gravitas. Already in 1785, a year before this 1786 concerto, Mozart wrote the C minor fantasy, towards the end of which we can almost hear the premises of the future Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, who, young student of Haydn in Vienna, played the Mozart concerto as a student, but was the D minor concerto 466, for which he composed the cadenza also, in the tonality of Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni! But the C minor concerto, first movement by Mozart, it's said that in 1800, Beethoven composed his C minor concerto number 3 a few years before the Fifth Symphony. So why am I putting all this together? Is because I find such incredibly intense, perhaps subconscious, unwilling, or perhaps willful continuum, inspiration, to call it borrowing and not stealing, of young Beethoven from young Mozart, who never got old, but the mature Mozart, the one that is not there only for seduction and also knows how to write music like this fantasy in C minor, that is just an expression of experience on earth, uncoated in niceties. And Mozart premiered his concerto in the park in Vienna on the Sunday subscription concerts, for which he composed in real time the days before the concerto without trying it on the piano, according to a letter of his father visiting him then in Vienna and being overwhelmed with the lightness of being of Mozart, while his music is so tragically, dramatically deep, as if the soundtrack of his life is reflected in his music, and his life itself is reflected in an unbearable lightness of being. Perhaps I put too much philosophy into all of it, but it's perhaps because I told you I find that a spiritual love for this concerto, beyond only the form or the genre and the style and the composer. I mean, who doesn't know Mozart? Who doesn't know Beethoven? But how they both ended up in short time, 15 years between the two concerti. Beethoven had a very interesting encounter, by the way, with that C minor concerto, which I find fascinating, and I want to share it with you. During these summer days, or early fall days, I guess, of Viennese outdoor concerts in a gazebo in the park, the subscription concerts, Mozart premiered many of his concerti, for which he didn't write the piano part, since he composed in real time on this horizontal size paper at least 8 bars of orchestra, and page by page he would pass the page to his friends, who would gather to have a drink at home or play pool or whatever they used to enjoy playing. And then they would copy the parts in real time while he composes it, but without a piano. And probably exchanging jokes and who knows what. Perhaps they over fantasize about it as well. But why not? After all, when you love, it's unconditional. And if it's spiritual love for the piece and unconditional for the guy that he was, not that anybody could consider Mozart a guy, that's terribly, let's say, inappropriate of mine to be so. Who am I to even think so? Let's say that I find it fascinating that this performance happens according to the letter of his father, like for the D minor concerto that he attended in the premiere in the same area, same place. He says that Mozart didn't even try on the keyboard the last movement, and in any case, with a chamber group that was surrounding him playing from the piano and conducting with the left hand, on the newly barely copied parts, in this reading session, which took place of what today's rehearsal session, though it was brand new then compared to now. Then everybody knows the piece and we still rehearse it. Of course we do. They were just reading it in public, and he was improvising the piano part, having found no need to write all the piano part, not only the cadenza, all the piano part throughout the piece. And then, of course, after the success of the performance, the publisher Artaria in Vienna of Mozart and of many asked him to make sure that because of the success, he would like to sell some scores to the, music patrons and amateur pianists who would like to purchase it. And so Mozart, days, months, weeks perhaps, I don't know exactly how long, but writes a piano part to fill in the empty spaces that were the piano part in the original performance, hastily composed. But as he used to say when they asked him, "Don't you sketch before you copy?" He said, "No, I sketch in my mind, comes out directly dictated, as if from somewhere." I don't know if he said that ending, that's a bit cheesy. Sorry again. Wolfgang, please, don't be mad at me. Perhaps I love him so much that I try to make him think himself being a divine child, though his mother called him Gottlieb as a middle name in German, which means loved by God, and going age 15 in Italy to learn how to write opera in the Italian tradition of the day. That was the opera in the first place, which means work in Italian anyway, anciently opus in Latin. He switched it himself to Amadeus, loved by God. So he must have had some kind of idea that perhaps God is dictating him and he doesn't need to sketch. Filters through his quick brain cells, I assume. And then, that third movement of the C minor concerto of Mozart is a theme and variations before a coda. Not a rondo like the sonata form that Haydn taught all of them in this so-called Viennese first school, or it is called like that. I don't think they call it first because they didn't think of a second one then. And so the theme is very austere in 4/4. Austere would be the best description, and I don't want to be paraphrasing the music which talks by itself more than better. No, the truth compared to what I can describe it. At least with a sense of gravitas. I still think that C minor is the tonality of gravitas. And so he has variations. Second variation. with air legato as I like to. Perhaps he didn't play it evenly like this. Perhaps he shaped all the articulations. Perhaps he made it more baroque. Perhaps he didn't even play what he wrote after the performance in order to write it down for the publisher. Perhaps he improvised. But this is a speculation, we don't know. What we know is that in the left-hand variation with the 16th notes and the scales, there's a struggle, I think, for that. I attribute a symbolism of struggle in these scales. So the Gazette of the next week after the performance in Vienna relates the performance of the concert, and they say that Beethoven attended this concert. And not only do they say that because he did, but mostly because he objected in public during the performance, standing up and saying, I didn't come here to hear how Mozart practice his scales. Could do that at home, in other words. So was it flamboyance of the young Beethoven being arrogant with his musical inheritance from Haydn and Mozart that he rejects? Is it because he was perhaps traditional at the time, which I don't really know that he would be so traditional. Perhaps he was exceptional too, for somebody to interrupt or disrupt, rather, because they didn't stop, I assume, when playing the performance and making such remark, to say the least, remark. And that's why I wanted to share this with you. What is so striking to me with all this is that when in 1800, 15 years later, he writes his third concerto in C minor, the key of Mozart's C minor concerto, what does he do when the piano enters? Because obviously the theme in the orchestra is exposed, like in most of the concerti, as a tutti, opera overture, the thematic material before the soloist plays. In 4/4 C minor. And Mozart's theme of the opening of his own tutti, first movement, is in 3/4 and has almost the same notes. And so when the piano enters in Beethoven's concerto, what does the pianist do? Is what makes me really jubilate, and at the same time being amazed by the fact that if supposedly the same man 15 years younger, which in those days was a lot of a lifetime because nobody lived beyond, well, Mozart died relatively young at 36, though for the time it must have been not in the 18th century ending, but could be that also. Beethoven didn't go beyond 56 anyway. So 15 years, it's a lot of maturation, you know. He makes the dramatic entrance of the solo part, the pianist, with the scales, the same scales he was making fun of Mozart's variation. Or he was mocking, rather. And I still think in a Beethoven third concerto, and probably not the only one to think so, it also represents symbolically the struggle. The scales are rising. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Silly to sing when you're not a singer. And what is interesting to observe in the treatment, of course, Mozart is principally a harpsichord brought up keyboardist who discovers the fortepiano, which is not yet fully, let's say, transitioned for the keyboard repertoire literature. they coexist for some time, like Johann Christian Bach sonatas, opus 6 and 15, the latest or last son of Bach among the composers, who was only 15 at his father's death in 1750. And Handel takes him and brings him to London to take him under his protection, and he becomes, therefore, thanks to Handel, he gets a job, which is to teach harpsichord to the children of the Queen and the King of England, whom Handel serves. Of course, he was a German prince from Hanover originally when they moved in after the succession story. But the fact is that the publishers wrote for Johann Christian Bach sonatas, which is about Haydn's time, between Bach 1750, what we call officially end of Baroque today, because it's a way to organize the chronology for teaching purposes. And the early classical period with Haydn's sonata form, two themes, development, recap, opposites attract and then develop and then unify. Aria ABA, Minuet or Scherzo ABA, and then the ABA CADA Rondo, perhaps in possible connections, the jig of the dance suites, the minuet of the dance suites, Scherzo, and then the sarabande, originally fast South American dance from way when 16th century, by the conquistadors even before bringing it, becoming the stately slow dance, would be the andante with the ABA aria form. In the sonata form that Haydn establishes, if not attributed to him, but probably not only. And then, of course, the two themes, development, opposites, and then unity in the first movement. So yeah, the sonata form for symphonies, for quartets, for trios, for sonatas, for concerti is like it's kind of a universal GPS blueprint that indicates by its organization for the music lovers who are listening or appreciating or commissioning or perhaps just being the patrons of music at the time, needing a lot of living music because there was no recorded music, so it had to be always being renewed. And Haydn wrote symphonies hand over fist for his boss Esterhazy, and before that Bach wrote cantatas weekly for his church job in Leipzig. So functional music, and then at some point after sacred it becomes, of course, no more the sacred music only, but it becomes secular. And the virtuosity develops, the quality of the interactions between a solo instrument and the orchestra too. Regardless, in Mozart's time, even towards the end of his life in 1786, which is only 5 years before he dies in 91, he plays fortepiano, and the Viennese fortepianos were not very projecting, the Stein and especially Haydn, after Mozart's death, Streicher was the other Austrian brain. Haydn goes to London for Miss Trotz's wedding, one of his former students. It happens to be that he's housed in front of the English factory for fortepianos that he appreciated very much for their very symphonic quality of majestic presence of sound, the Broadwood factory. And he mentioned, compared to the Viennese that were very weak sounding, this was really effective. And of course the fortepiano was not a single one, it was still in progression. They still had the steel strings with gut strings and leather tops of the tips of the hammers. So the projection was on 2 strings out of 1 for the Unacorda, literally 1 string. Eine Seite, as Beethoven writes sometimes in German, the indication. And so the projection was perhaps more effective for a regular I don't know the size of the hall. Probably they played in large salons or mansions, and in the case of Mozart, in open air, so the acoustic must have been really in trouble because it didn't have resonance to enhance. But nevertheless, they are light enough to transport and bring in and out, compared to the iron cast modern pianos that had progressively of course, steel strings, and by 3 instead of 2, and the felt hammer tips. And so progressively the pianofortes became more projecting and more longer lasting sounds with pedal. And therefore, when they played with the orchestra, the very concept of a concerto became more of an army of one, the soloist heroically, in the romantic era, European 19th century starting, heroism like operatic heroes, competing or combating or roughing edges with the orchestra as an entity. Whenever in the Bach into Haydn into early Mozart concerti, which by the way the first 3 were by Johann Christian Bach, who offered him his sonatas opus 6 when as a child prodigy. Leopold brought Mozart in London as well, and they met with Johann Christian, and Mozart immediately adapted for piano and orchestra as a child the first 3 of the sonatas opus 6 by Johann Christian. So there is some kind of a flow of events, more or less. Everybody's more or less aware or just exploring and going further and developing, and fantastic times. But the main reason for which this is so striking to me is that by 1800 the fortepiano is way more projecting than in at least 1786, and therefore the genre, the dialogue, the opposition of characters, the volume of the pianists or the soloists, or forte, since it's a pianoforte, not just pianist, but he chose to call it for the soft dynamic of its etymological name of the invention. That was the fortepiano. In Mozart, it's still part of the chamber group, enhanced chamber group. Whenever in Beethoven, it's really an opposition between the tutti and the soloist. And that is prefiguring what will be magnified by Chopin, Liszt, Grieg, Schumann, Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky in between and beyond, Prokofiev, and it only goes more and more in the power of the instrument and the technique and the projection versus the orchestra. Whenever the Concerto Grosso style, from the Brandenburg of Bach into Haydn's D major concerto, into Mozart concerti that are possibly piano and winds chamber music with strings as a resonant carpet, Klangteppich as the German used to call it. But still there is a piano solo part, if not so dramatically brought out or so dramatically opposing the orchestra, character-wise, operatically. And the instrument's development created this possibility. In fact, the two go in hand. And this kind of concerto in C minor for Mozart was not only for the brooding, dark, dramatic color of this tonality. No, not everybody believes in the same way, for each tonality having specific characteristic and attributing a specific mood for the different choices of tonalities. To a certain extent one can agree or disagree, because after all it's subjective. But for C minor there is also another reason which is very important to put ahead here in this demonstration of mine between the two concerti, is that Mozart became a Frankmason according to his friend Stadler, who was clarinetist and for whom he composed the A major concerto and the A major clarinet quintet with a string quartet, and this in 3 sharp key, A major, and C minor or E flat major, 3 flat key in the key signature of both. And the 3 key signature flats or sharps represented also symbolically for the Masonry, of course, the Holy Trinity, and that was a symbol. He even wrote, Mozart wrote C minor woodwind, or basically wind orchestra, funeral Masonic music. He wrote his most Masonic, if not the Masonic opera, for the Age of Enlightenment hit in Europe at the same time. That is the E flat major opera, The Magic Flute. And so there is symbolism in the choice of the tonality for Mozart. But I think it's anecdotic but factual. This one was not specifically commissioned compared to the Masonic funeral music, but he chose C minor. Would love to ask him why. I did ask one day Dutilleux why he wrote his sonata in 44 in F sharp minor. He told me I was quoting something in it because it was 50 years later and he was very old. He didn't remember what. Of course, I know it's a silly question to ask the composer unless it's a necessity for the instrument. You know, B-flat clarinet usually is in flat keys, or string instruments mostly in sharp keys. But for pianos, the chromatic keyboards doesn't really matter, except the tuning before the well-tempered tuning for Bach's time, and then after that it became more homogenized. But there are still colorizations, you know, the famous Scriabin theory, and not only Rimsky-Korsakov had a different one, but at the same point of view about the synesthesia, you combine colors with tonalities or pitches. And so Scriabin even wrote the Prometheus concerto for colored piano. So there is some kind of a relation that people perhaps put in their own passion into the choice of this or that, for the tonality, the color, the mood, the atmosphere. They compare it to other pieces of similar situations, and then they start drawing conclusions. I mean, makes sense, except that even the exceptions confirm the sense, I guess. That's the rule is confirmed always by its exceptions in a way. But there isn't a rule, it's probably an unwritten rule. It's just also the fact that, when I asked Dutilleux and his sonata, by the way, it uses a lot of descending minor thirds. The symbol through the whole sonata, same with the thematical material, it goes all over the piece, with the three movements of his 1944 composed piano sonata. And there is the Brahms scherzo from the D minor sonata for violin and piano, and I remember calling him back saying, perhaps what you wanted to quote was it the F sharp minor scherzo of the D minor violin and piano sonata by Brahms? And he was Madame Joie. He always called her so, even if she was his wife, and my chamber music teacher too, who premiered his sonata. She was the Clara of Dutilleux, who couldn't play himself the piano. I mean, pianistically. He said, yeah, she was working on it with Michel Auclair, her violin partner. Both were afterwards conservatory teachers, and when I was a student. And he said, that's the piece I was quoting. Hence the F sharp minor key. So who knows why Mozart did C minor? And perhaps it's not important after all. We receive it, we don't have to question it. We have to love it, serve it. And if it moves us, it becomes personal, which is exactly what happened here, as you noticed with your host, because that's why it's so meaningful to me. So to start with the opening, when Mozart writes his theme, and Beethoven 15 years later, okay, we get it. The theme is an arpeggio of the perfect minor triad of C minor. Then most of the concerti, and Mozart wrote altogether 27, so by that time he had written 23 because this is the 24th. After the improvised cadenza with or without ending of a trill. Normally the coda is in the orchestra after the opening tutti, and the closing after the cadenza is the very brief conclusion before the slow movement in the center, before the last movement, which faster. So fast, slow, fast. And after the cadenza, which is where the supposedly soloists and more displays with their improvisation their own virtuosity. Of course, within the time period, it was inevitably in the same style. Today that we play the music of the past period, we have to either write or compose or improvise it in the style. That's the opening of Mozart's entrance of the solo, and in my cadenza. But many composers, many pianists who didn't compose or just composed for the cadenza, composed their own C minor Mozart concerto cadenza. And of course today, more than before, you can eventually decide that because you're in the 20th, now 21st century, you can write atonal or modal, or don't have to use the cadenza solo section to be in the stylistic element of the concerto, though I personally did, in order to blend in the style. But at the time they didn't have to not blend, because they're living in their music style. The language was common, and the grammar was common to the tonal system. So normally after the cadenza, and the orchestra would do, or very short ending, but only the orchestra. And Mozart decides to not do so, and to have the piano re-enter for the coda with broken arpeggios on the C minor pedal harmonic one, the ostinato. 5 of 4, 7 with a diminished seventh, 1, 7, and then finishes with the arpeggios of C minor, 1. And the orchestra accompanies. So an anticlimactic, soft, dynamic ending after the cadenza, very demonstrative. Instead of that, he finishes associating the piano as a decorative accompaniment to the orchestra. That's the dotted rhythm of the thematic material that is heard already in the end of the development before the recap. But this time, of course, of the dominant. Already, even in that section, Mozart uses scales in the piano part before the third movement scales that triggered Beethoven's comment in public, or so they say. Meanwhile, when Beethoven writes his third concerto in 1800, about 16 years after Mozart's, and after Mozart's already been dead, of course, he writes his concerto, and when the end of the cadenza, he writes himself his own cadenza. He doesn't finish with the orchestra tutti and end. He extends the trill chromatically and because he's so good at using portions of the thematic material, because he loves playing with the material for the developments, and in this case with the conclusion, which is the tail of his first theme in the coda. After the cadenza, the orchestra plays also 5 of 4 and 7, exactly like Mozart. It's not exactly unique to Mozart. I mean, every Bach prelude and fugue visits 4, and then with the or with the dominant secondary one of 4, subdominant, and so on. So, but nevertheless, the fact is that after the cadenza, he finishes with the orchestra and the piano together, just like Mozart did for the first time for a piano concerto 15 years earlier. So, inspiration, influence, borrowing, or just prolongation, perhaps. I like to think so. And so, and the Beethoven arpeggios go down. And like, unlike Mozart finishing the first movement anticlimactic soft, he goes into his, I called it pre-fifth symphony. What does the piano do with the tutti to finish the movement? The infamous scales going up of the introduction. So you see how much cousinage, how much connection, how much homage or borrowing or stealing or just perhaps prolongation. I still don't know which one is what, but it's very interesting how close in time, in the same city, with the very strong personalities of these two gentlemen who certainly were not easily influenceable, what power this music must have been over Beethoven of Mozart's. In a way, it's like Schubert's, who didn't dare meet Beethoven even in the same city. Of course, unlike Mozart and Beethoven, who were prominent figures in the music scene of Vienna, Schubert was totally out of it. He didn't have he was too shy or too insecure, and he just composed such marvels, but he never had a chance to be even played because he didn't get to be premiered, but he kept writing so much. But a lot of it is inspired early Mozart and mostly Beethoven. And I think in a way Beethoven inspired by Mozart. Perhaps Mozart older would have been inspired also by Beethoven mature. After all, would have been not unthinkable. Mozart would have been only 50 or some at that point when Beethoven writes, if he was alive, the third concerto. And then Schubert dies also a year after Beethoven, but much younger, in 1828. So who knows, if Schubert lived Beethoven's age until 56, he would have been dying almost the same time as as Chopin in 1849, almost. It's crazy how these overlappings happen in short time, because people had intense short lives but very creative. And of course, people is not people, it's amazing individuals. I mean, a Chopin, a Schumann, a Brahms, a Liszt after that, and before that, Haydn and Mozart. I mean, give me a break, right? It's not just people. Giants. And producing almost industrial quantity of survival music. After all, music was consumed by their patrons and needed to always be renewed. And they managed to write unbelievably complex, subtle, philosophic, perhaps not all, but a lot, and perhaps I put in too much into all, but I find that for expedient music, they write very complex, unrehearsed, just read, and in real time. They must have owned such a good grammar of music to correct in real time the inevitable blurbs of a copyist. Hell, today it still happens. Even if we played after so many centuries or so many editions, we still have to rehearse to clear up everything, articulations, eventual misreadings, etc. Imagine then. But of course that was different ways, because people were taught in the 18th century musicianship, grammar and performance, as well as composition, and it was all part of a general holistic musicianship. Today, of course, the technology calls us to think that we have to earlier channel the musicianship into representative of the performers, representative of the thinkers, the musicologists, scholars, and the composers, the publishers, the festival directors, the recording engineers, the directors of radio stations, the producers, the orchestra managers. I mean, there's so many ways to serve music at a different way than all of them in the same person. Perhaps Bernstein was one of them in the 20th century who played and conducted and composed. And it has to be not an obligation. It's a calling, after all. But the fact is that in that first movement, wow, the cousinage of the two is striking. And interestingly, the choice of the tonality in the second movement, the audacity of which escapes to most people today, to start in E major when you have a C minor concerto, you expect to be in the relative major, E flat major, which is what Mozart does. Which shows how Mozart is not interested a bit by revolutionizing the order of things. He's not uncomfortable with it. He just accepts it and just writes unbelievable melodies. He writes everything as an opera aria, even for the piano. And Beethoven writes also lyrical, but it's not only intuitive and beautiful and melodic and just fresh like an unforgettable perfume of a beloved person, memories, smile. It's just so touching in Mozart. And Beethoven is also meaningful, not only beautiful. I mean, Mozart is meaningful too, but it's not more meaningful than charming. It's equally the two. And Beethoven is charming, but it's also with a lot of intensity in the thought, the harmonization, quasi-chorale, meaning the notes of the melody with the harmonization. Sorry, I played it in fast tempo. But the melody still, he doesn't do an arpeggiation or an Alberti. But more than that, the choice of E major instead of E flat major is as if he chose in flat keys, in harmonically spelled, it will be F flat major. And of course he finishes with the 10th on the last chord, which is the up interval of the third. And that G sharp of the E major in harmonically in sharps, but if it were in flats would be an A flat. And the piano starts the third movement, returning to C minor by the common note between E major or A flat major, which is A flat, the 6th degree of C minor, or the 3rd degree of E major. But in the first entrance of the second movement, where the piano starts before the orchestra, so we finish here. Wow, at once, without any preparation. That is cutting edge modern, and today we should consider it bold and audacity that is so striking, because the other composer after Beethoven who wrote a C minor concerto with an E major slow movement is Rachmaninoff, who wrote his second piano concerto in C minor. And his slow movement is in E major. The cheesy story being that supposedly, I don't know how to believe it, or is it because it makes the story, but perhaps there is some to it that is not only anecdotic, well, perhaps both, that Glazunov conducted it drunk, meaning the symphony number 1 of Rachmaninoff, who was barely a student, and Moscow Conservatory or some. And that after the bad reception, accordingly to the story, because of that situation of Glazunov conducting supposedly drunk, though I'm not sure that was really the case, or that he couldn't conduct being drunk. I wasn't there and I won't judge, but all I know is that Dahl, this German disciple of Freud, who invented at that time in Vienna in the end of the 19th century the science of psychoanalysis, was sent, Rachmaninoff was sent to him to get out of his post-trauma of the first symphony of his bad reception because of this performance that was so bad, or because the piece was bad. I think it's a little bit of the two, but nevertheless, Dr. Dahl gives him an assignment to get out of his depression, write a concerto, and he writes that C minor famous concerto which starts with a subdominant. Well, exactly, not with a dominant in a bass. An ostinato of the subdominant. But Rachmaninoff, who comes a century and a half after Beethoven, wouldn't need to worry about E major being an audacious tonality. He was such a, since early age, very gifted pianist and worked very hard. Zverev was his teacher. They were same age students with co-students with Scriabin, 10 years old both or so. He knew the Beethoven Third Concerto, but Rachmaninoff proceeds with an introduction in a slow movement of the orchestra. Prepare the E major transition for the beginning of the slow movement, and equally at the end, when the piano finishes the last chord of the second movement, before he starts the finale of the C minor concerto, he has introduction of the orchestra modulating and preparing, and then, well, that's the first movement's theme, but anyway, he goes back to C minor, but he uses transitions whenever Beethoven in 1800 goes directly. That's something that I find so bold. Of course, one can argue, who cares in what key it is? It could have been in G major. It would have been equally beautiful if he had written it in E flat major, the expected relative major to principal C minor. But of course he didn't, and I think we valorize it because partly of that audacity that could escape today to us in the post-tonal tonality times, which at the time were not even post, they were pre-post, whatever. So is it for colorization? Is it because he also associated it with I don't know what the tonalities, but nevertheless, it's a first time, and it's boldly so. And Rachmaninoff, paradoxically, is more traditionalist than Beethoven for using a transition between the first and second and third movement to go from. It's almost striking. Not that Rachmaninoff is old-fashioned, though in a way he is. He's, like all composers, timeless. We just compare them to the chronology of others, but I still think that that's the beauty of the composers, when they have an inspiration and a conviction and a style and a genre and an earnestness, and they express, in fact, all what we live through humanity, and we can adhere to it, we connect to it, listeners, performers, if we anticipate it in a way, we participate, and also we become it while we play it, like this universal theater plays that speak about humanity's love, hope, despair, hate, and all that, this universality of the times. But in the traditional sense, yes, I could say Rachmaninoff, even compared to Scriabin, who was his contemporary, was more less daring, let's say, to be quasi-atonal, like Scriabin did quickly before he died very young in 1915, and Rachmaninoff only in the 40s, early mid-40s, when he dies in Beverly Hills. So the third movement of the concerto of Beethoven is the typical rondo form. Now, for once, after the innovation in the tonality of the second movement, which by the rest is another aria, and Mozart does. So they use the same genre of the aria in the ABA form. But because in Mozart he goes to relative minor, which is again C minor. And Beethoven uses the middle section in G major with a bassoon and wind instruments answering. section of the E major slow movement, B section is G major, and Mozart's is E flat major, and then C minor is its relative minor, which is the original key. Compare, does comparing it always lead to a conclusion? Yes, but yes, but could differently, but forward thinking or more traditionally thinking or expected or surprising? I don't know how much of both. In a way, I just love for what they are, and it's just so amazing to have such false siblings, but so looking alike between the two concerti, as if there is kind of an invisible thread of the two, as if there is an homage and a competition and a desire to push it further in the dramatic effect and the pianistic effect. It's interesting, very. That's why I share it with you today, because it lives with me for a long time. This duality or this complementarity or this opposition or competition, and then of course Mozart doesn't do the rondo, which he does in so many of his other concerti. The Ländler kind of song that brings everybody back to some kind of almost pop music or country music, which often is a quotation of some nursery song, well, whatever. But after the intense slow movement, usually it comes as a freeing of the spirit and just living lightheartedly the piece. And people, like in arias of operas, after they heard the opera, some aria sticks more than another by its melodic element, and people whistle it in the streets. Mozart, according to also his own letters, used to like people whistling the themes or melodic lines of some of his operas, famous arias, walking in the streets of Vienna. Must have been something fun for him. Rewarding? I don't know, but he must have liked to be popular. There was no pop music per se then, but that was perhaps partly becoming that when it was taken by the general audience, not just the elite of the patrons or the performers themselves, just their regular folks. And of course, these theme and variations are incredibly chromatic, dark, atmospheric. And then when he ends the last variation, Mozart goes into a 6/8, since his theme and the variations are in 4/4, very square, which was the original 4/4 of Beethoven's first movement. When Mozart's first movement was in 3/4, even if you can say that by 4 bars of 3, it's a 12/4 anyway, because of the upper structure. But let's say in the last movement, for sure, it's in 4/4, and then the coda is in 6/8. Playful but dramatically chromatic, in a way sad and happy, bittersweet. So Beethoven's finale is in 4. And then Beethoven's coda is also in 6/8. But unlike Mozart's C minor, even if chromatic, therefore having portions of major, the E natural and the minor, Beethoven goes full major. Festive in opera buffa style, very Mozartian for the Italian era operas of his. Very uncharacteristic of Beethoven, who doesn't write light music for the last movement. Usually he's heavier, dramatic, even if heartfelt. Well, anyway, I'm not going to psychoanalyze his music. I'm just saying that it's interesting that both, and therefore Beethoven, 15 years after Mozart, decides to finish also in 6/8, like Beethoven, Mozart. So the coda of the first movement after the cadenza, the coda of the third movement after the theme and variations or rondo form is a playful, driven, uplifting and conclusive coda. the arias of the second movement in the different key choices. Also the orchestration. Mozart's orchestration is lighter on the strings and more on the woodwinds. For instance, in the slow movement, he has the orchestra play the strings and the winds as a group by themselves. Or in the coda of the first movement's development, bassoon, clarinet, oboe, flute. It is factual that Mozart's writing is piano and winds, and the strings are not so thematic, they're just more mood setting. It's really dialogue, it's almost chamber music, like the piano quintet he wrote for piano and winds. In this case, I think it's an enhanced piano quintet winds with strings. Whenever Beethoven is extremely symphonic, and the piano is extremely playing versus the orchestra as more of an entity rather than a groupment of the woodwinds. Of course, in Beethoven's time, already the instrument projected more. The orchestras had more musicians rather than the chamber group surrounding Mozart on the gazebo. He must have been in a concert hall with more resonance. Little by little, the texture of the orchestra becomes richer, and the texture of the piano part also, when he does and the orchestra plays that too. It's like almost if the soloist competes to show muscle equal to the orchestra, so it becomes the concerto in the pre-romantic era of Beethoven, or already started the romantic era through Beethoven, is the opposition of characters between the one, okay, the army of one, and the many. So it's an epic battle that the instruments allow, and therefore the genre evolves from the concerto grosso, where the soloist steps out for a few lines and then joins the group and plays in unison. And at that time, less conducting playing happens because the left hand of the piano is so full of stuff that in Mozart's concerti, most of the left hand is filling up with Alberti or some other patterns, because in fact he conducted the left hand and he didn't really play a lot of left hand accompaniment because the orchestra plays it and the left hand dubs it, at least in the way he filled up the orchestra score when it was to be published. I don't know what he did when he improvised. Nobody has, unfortunately, taken it on dictation. Factually, we only know one thing, is that Mozart, I think, deeply influenced Beethoven for the C minor ring, and he went into 1786 Mozart C minor concerto, 1800 Beethoven's third concerto, and then a few years later Beethoven's fifth symphony, and a year before Mozart's concerto, 1785, the C minor fantasy. That's really amazing C minoring in this Viennese school in a less than almost 15 to 20 years period. And of course the concerti are beautiful for themselves, naturally. They don't need to be compared, and as I just did, as if they have to be compared. I compare them because I find that there are passionately probably impulsive, subconscious or willing homage imitations, or just continuation of what Mozart started in that C minor concerto that Beethoven in a way pushed further. Not in the same direction exactly, because he rejects a lot of Mozart's ways of developing a thematic material. Beethoven is different, and but still there is this communality, and the fact that we know that Beethoven played as a soloist, as a student in his early age, the D minor Mozart concerto. I wish it was the C minor for the story, but it doesn't fit, and it doesn't have to be to have played it. He could have heard it, as he supposedly did that day, where the gazettes of Vienna say that he manifested his disagreement with Herr Mozart practicing his scales in public. how much of all this is really true or traceable, and if it is it overstated or is it just embellished? Perhaps all these anecdotes aside, when you hear when you write that in 1785 and then in 1805 you write, there's got to be, I find that almost electrifying. Well, I do, perhaps it's not necessarily that, but at least moving, besides being a healthy curiosity, I would say, to try to compare, contrast, combine, and then love them independently, fully for what they are, not for comparing them. I love to play both. Though I must confess, Mozart, I love playing more. I don't know why, actually. It's not even rational or analytical or instrumental or technical. Perhaps I don't know, I was introduced to the Mozart concerto before I was introduced to the Beethoven concerto. It could be just that. Sometimes it's the opposite. We don't choose how we hear it here or there. And when we grow up, since people play those pieces, the Mozart concerto is less often played than than the Beethoven third. But at this point today, this is no competition. They're both amazing, established, incredible works that have such communality that is really soulful. Well, there you go. For whatever all that meant, I love to have shared it with you, because it means to me a lot, actually. Even if by itself you could think that all these comparisons are superficial. Possibly, actually, I almost think of it too. But during the performance, you immerse yourself in their language, in their chromaticism, in their expression, in their second theme, in their bridges, in their connections, in the way they develop the thoughts, the way they state the things, the way they choose the moment where they modulate, ornament, or decorate, or surprise, and a diminished seventh here, and a triad there, and then the orchestra interaction is a contradiction or a completion with the soloist, and at so many levels, the pedaling, the articulation, the phrasing, the direction of the line, the meaningful storytelling that goes beyond lyrics, because obviously there aren't any, even if they're reminiscent of the arias of the operas that they wrote. Thank you very much.